Listen and imagine the first city waking at dawn, clay buildings slowly warming under a pale sun, voices rising in a language older than memory. This is Uruk, a place of white stone and mud brick, where the walls themselves keep stories. For the people who lived there, the world had shape and purpose, and among those shapes grew a name that would travel far beyond the alleys and canals where water shimmered, Gilgamesh. His beginnings are not simple. To the Sumerians he was both man and more than man, a ruler whose body and mind reached beyond ordinary limits. They described him through stories that found their homes in temple schools and the hands of scribes who pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay. Those marks preserved not just events but a sense of what it meant to be a king, a friend, and a seeker of meaning. The city of Uruk itself feels like a character in these tales, an urban heart beating with ritual and politics. Its temples and walls were real, the evidence of stone and pottery testifying to lives of trade and ceremony. The people saw in their king the living image of the city's power. When they spoke of Gilgamesh, they also spoke of Uruk's greatness, its markets and its gardens, its ziggurat reaching to the sky like a ladder for the gods. Parentage matters in myths, and Gilgamesh's lineage is taught with a mix of pride and prophecy. His mother, Nin-sun, was a wise woman, sometimes called a goddess. She read omens and spoke with insight. His father, often named as Lugalbanda, carries with him the shadow of heroism and the suggestion that the king inherits extraordinary traits. This pairing of the mortal and the divine gives Gilgamesh a foothold in both worlds, which is where much of his story unfolds. The Sumerian tales do not present a single, consistent biography. Instead, they offer episodes, fragments of adventures, moments of triumph, and sudden reversals. In one story, he stands as a tyrant, a young king whose strength is dangerous to his own people. In another, he is a friendless wanderer who longs for companionship. In a third, he feels the sting of loss so deep that it changes him. These variations show how the Sumerians used myth to explore different faces of leadership and humanity. The creation of Enkidu is a pivotal episode in his origin story and one that reveals much about Sumerian values. Enkidu begins as a wild man, formed by the gods to be a counterpart to Gilgamesh, someone as strong and natural as the fields and animals. He roams with the herds, uncivilized and free, until a woman from the city, embodying civilization itself, brings him to human society. Their ensuing friendship becomes the engine of the narrative, a bond that softens Gilgamesh's destructiveness and teaches both men about loyalty and loss. Enkidu's story teaches about transformation, the move from wilderness to culture, from instinct to law. The Sumerians saw the city as order, a place where ritual and law tamed the wild. When Enkidu is brought into Uruk, he learns speech and custom, and he learns to stand beside the king rather than against him. It is this change that begins Gilgamesh's first great metamorphosis, from a ruler feared by his own people to a leader with a companion who can both challenge and comfort him. The tales that survive, written on clay tablets, carry the texture of an oral tradition. Scribes copied them, edited them, and passed them through generations. Over time the stories grew, absorbed local variations, and sometimes contradicted one another. The difference between what priests taught in the temple and what a town crier might tell at the market is part of the richness of those early myths. Among the narratives that shaped Gilgamesh's origin is the confrontation with Huwawa, a monstrous guardian of the cedar forest. The cedar forest lay at the edges of the known world, a place of towering trees and primeval danger. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu enter this realm and face Huwawa, they are staking a claim upon the wild's resources as well as testing their own courage. Their victory becomes a proof of kingly virtue, but it also weighs on their consciences and on the balance between humankind and the gods. The Bull of Heaven episode is another turning point with roots in celestial politics. In this story, the goddess Ishtar, known in Sumerian as Inanna and later in other cultures by other names, demands Gilgamesh's attention and more than his attention. When he spurns her, she sends the bull of heaven to punish him and his city. Enkidu and Gilgamesh together slay the beast, an act that angers the gods and brings devastating consequences. The killing of the bull marks a crossing of boundaries. Human action now interferes directly with divine will, and tragedy is the price. Death and the fear of death are woven tightly into Gilgamesh's identity. The Sumerians understood the world as a place where the gods were powerful and where mortality was absolute. Gilgamesh's grief after Enkidu's death forces him to confront the truth every ruler must face: no status, no strength, no favor from gods can make man immortal. This realization propels him on a quest that is as much inward as it is outward, a search for meaning and for any promise of lasting renown. To chase immortality is to find oneself between myth and the human need for legacy. Gilgamesh sails, he seeks sages, and he seeks gates that mark the places where the divine touches the human. In the Sumerian accounts, that journey involves encounters with counselor figures and with cryptic answers that do not yield easy solutions. The gods are not simply obstacles, they are mirrors for the human condition, reflecting both the limits and the possibilities of mortal lives. The Sumerian poems do not end with a simple moral. They weave images of kingship, friendship, temple ritual, and the landscapes of Mesopotamia into lessons that are both practical and poetic. A king must build walls and canals, provide grain and justice, and at the same time listen to the rhythms of the gods and the omens. Gilgamesh's story shows how these demands can conflict and how a ruler's personal journey influences a city's fate. Archaeology gives texture to these myths. Excavations at Uruk, beginning in the 19th century, uncovered tablets and fragments that tied the legendary city to the physical remains of palaces and temples. Cuneiform tablets, once soft clay impressed by reed styluses, hardened into durable records. The fragments do not always fit neatly, but they point to a long tradition of storytelling that was practiced in schools and shrines and shared across generations. The Sumerian king list is a strange companion to the Gilgamesh narratives. It lists kings who ruled before the flood with impossibly long reigns, then names rulers of historical periods with more plausible lifespans. Gilgamesh appears in some versions of these lists as a king of Uruk, a bridge between mythic time and historical record. This appearance shows how the Sumerians used their past to define the present, to claim a continuity that gave legitimacy to rulers and city institutions. Language itself shapes the picture of Gilgamesh. Sumerian is an agglutinative language with syntax and rhythms different from English. Its poetic devices emphasize repetition and parallelism, giving myth a cadence that could be chanted or recited. When translators render Sumerian lines into modern tongues, some of the original texture is necessarily lost, but the emotional core, the force of companionship, the ache of loss, remains. The stories were meant to be heard as well as read, to move listeners as much as they instructed scribes. The gods in these tales are neither wholly remote nor entirely humane. They command the cosmos with agendas that sometimes look like petty human politics. Inanna stands as an example, brilliant, capricious, and powerful. Enlil, responsible for both wind and decree, can be stern and implacable. Gilgamesh negotiates with these powers, not through passive supplication but by acts that demand attention. That is part of his origin. He belongs to a world where human boldness can alter the course of events and yet does not absolve men from consequences. Sumerian culture prized both the practical and the poetic, and Gilgamesh moves through both realms. He orders city walls built, he inspects the grain, and he presides over justice, but he also composes songs and seeks wisdom from aging sages. The figure of the wise king, tuned to the needs of his city and to the complexities of the divine, is a recurrent ideal. Gilgamesh's failures and successes are therefore educational. They instruct listeners about the perils of arrogance and the rewards of humility tempered by courage. The authors of these stories were often temple scribes who worked within the intersection of religion, administration, and education. Their hands copied not just business records but also myths, and the classroom where students practiced their script was the same place where they learned their culture's tales. Through such repetition, narratives of Gilgamesh became part of civic memory, a way for citizens to understand their past and their expectations for leadership. When one hears these stories, one hears the voices of administrators, priests, and storytellers all rolled into a single chorus. Over centuries, the name Gilgamesh traveled and changed. The Akkadians, who spoke a Semitic language and later dominated Mesopotamia, absorbed Sumerian culture and adapted its stories. The Akkadian version of Gilgamesh preserves many Sumerian elements while reshaping the language and some of the emphases. Later retellings in Babylon and beyond continued the shift, showing how myths travel like rivers, shifting banks as they flow through new lands and tongues. The motif of the hero king who learns from pain and friendship resonated widely because it addressed universal concerns. Rulers who adopted Gilgamesh's image did not necessarily mean to celebrate pride. Rather, they embraced the story's complexity, how greatness can include vulnerability, how leadership demands more than force. In that sense, the Sumerian myths functioned as a mirror for rulers and citizens, reflecting ideals and warnings both. Despite his larger-than-life traits, Gilgamesh's origins are linked closely to very human realities: the management of water, the need for walls against raiders, and the cultivation of crops in a floodplain that could just as easily fail. The stories embed technical knowledge in narrative form, teaching how canals should be maintained and why rituals for crops matter. Myth and administration intertwined, making the tales both instructive and aesthetically powerful. The imagery of rivers and gardens in these myths cannot be overstated. Mesopotamia means the land between rivers, and water is both bounty and threat. Gardens represent order, a taming of nature, and the palace gardens of Uruk become metaphors for civilization itself. Gilgamesh walks these gardens, and his encounters there reveal how intimately a king's identity is bound to the land he governs. Every depiction of Gilgamesh contains contradictions that the Sumerians seem to have relished. He is proud but capable of compassion, violent and yet seeking wisdom, mortal and yet reaching for the divine. These tensions are not resolved in tidy lessons. Instead, they play out across episodes that show him learning in fits and starts. The result is a portrait of leadership as an ongoing negotiation rather than a fixed state. The figure of Gilgamesh also reflects Sumerian concerns about the afterlife. The Sumerian view was bleak in many accounts. The afterlife is a dark house where the dead live like guests at a shadowy feast. In that cosmology, fame is one of the few consolations, a way to ensure that one's name endures among the living. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality can therefore be read as a search for a name that will survive the silence of the grave. Scribes shaped the memory of Gilgamesh through repeated copying and reworking. A line altered here, an epithet added there, could change tone or meaning. Over generations, certain episodes expanded, while others faded. What remains is a mosaic, a set of images and lines that together give a sense of a hero's origin without ever claiming to be a seamless chronicle. Oral performance likely accompanied the written word in ancient Uruk. Imagine a storyteller in the temple courtyard, hands moving as he speaks, the audience leaning into the cadence of the tale. That performative space allowed new interpretations to emerge as listeners reacted and the teller adjusted. These live variations fed back into the written tradition, so that the clay tablets are only part of the story's life. The architecture of Uruk set the stage for Gilgamesh's cultural meaning. Massive walls protected a bustling center of worship and trade. In that built environment, stories about the city's kings served as both propaganda and comfort, a way to legitimize power and to give citizens a language for shared history. Gilgamesh's presence in myth and in the city's monuments fused leader and locale into a single symbol. Women in these tales often act with authority and agency, shaping outcomes in ways subtle and decisive. Ninsen's wisdom guides Gilgamesh, the temple women, who brought Enkidu into human society, represented the civilizing power of feminine creativity and ritual. Inanna, whose desires and vengeance propel major episodes, embodies a divine force that does not answer to male authority. These female figures complicate any simplistic reading of the myths as merely patriarchal affirmation. The ethical lessons in these tales are rarely handed down in explicit maxims. Instead, they unfold through scenarios: how a leader treats his people, how a friend sacrifices for another, how grief reshapes a heart. These scenes operate like case studies, inviting citizens to interpret and to emulate. The point is less to offer a recipe for virtuous government than to present a world in which choices have consequences, both immediate and cosmic. Gilgamesh's mythic origin intersects with technology as well. The very act of writing allowed Sumerians to fix their stories in a way that previous oral cultures could not. Writing enabled bureaucracies, but it also preserved songs and myths with a precision that allowed later generations to reconstruct their ancestral past. The irony is plain: a medium invented to record grain receipts and labor lists also kept a hero alive in the storyteller's mind. Over time, Gilgamesh's story became a resource for reflection on mortality and for consolation in the face of loss. Readers and listeners could see their own anxieties mirrored in his search. When he stands before a wise figure, when he listens to tales of older heroes, the narrative invites us to imagine what wisdom looks like when it arrives late and irregularly. The Sumerians did not promise immortality; they offered ways to live meaningfully despite death's certainty. The fragments themselves reveal surprising psychological depth. Enkidu's mourning, Gilgamesh's dread, the gods' occasional petty cruelty, these are not shallow plot mechanics but explorations of emotion. The Sumerians allowed their hero to be vulnerable, to make terrible mistakes, and then to seek redemption. That emotional honesty is part of what gives the myth staying power across centuries. Comparisons with later epics show how foundational these Sumerian tales were. Homer's heroes speak with a cadence that echoes the older Near Eastern sagas. Motifs of boat journeys and immortal quests reappear across the ancient world. While cultures adapt and transform myths to fit new needs, the core questions remain: how to live well, how to cope with loss, how to govern with compassion. Gilgamesh's origin stories lie at the root of that long conversation. In quieter moments, the myth also becomes a meditation on friendship itself. The bond between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is textured and ambiguous, a relationship forged in competition and sealed in affection. Their conversations reveal a tenderness that humanizes even a monarch's excesses. When the bond is broken by death, the pain is not merely personal. It reverberates across the city and the cosmos, reminding listeners of the communal stakes of private grief. Time reshaped the material traces of these stories. Tablets fragmented, languages shifted, and whole episodes were lost to the centuries. Yet enough survived that modern scholars can reconstruct portions of the Sumerian cycles and the later Akkadian epic. These reconstructions are themselves acts of storytelling, attempts to reunite scattered pieces into a coherent narrative that mirrors the way ancient scribes once stitched together variants into classroom texts. One can hear in these tales the noise of a world in which gods walked closer to humanity than modern readers might expect. Divinity in Sumerian thought is intimate, woven into the fabric of daily life through rituals, offerings, and the presence of temples. Gilgamesh's conversations with the divine show how human inquiry and divine decree were entangled. For him, and for the people who told his story, the gods were not distant abstractions but active participants in history. The physical remains of Gilgamesh's Uruk, from its levees to its baked bricks, give the myth a geography that anchors its flights of wonder. When Gilgamesh walks the city, he is moving through a landscape that millions recognized. The concrete details, gardens, granaries, and the river, lend the king an earthy realism that balances his mythic ambitions. This blend of realism and myth makes the stories accessible to ordinary citizens, who could point to familiar places and see them in the narrative. Sumerian myths preserve a tension between the collective and the individual. The community expects its ruler to perform duties that bind him to civic welfare, yet individual longing drives much of the plot. Gilgamesh's private grief and private yearning become public matters because his life is inseparable from the city's well-being. This interplay teaches listeners that personal transformations can alter a community's fate, and vice versa. Even the names of places and people carry meaning. Uruk, often associated with broad, noble connotations, frames the hero's identity. The name Enkidu evokes the countryside and life at the margins of civilization. The Sumerians used names as signposts within their narratives, and those signposts helped audiences follow moral and emotional geography as a story unfolded. Names were not merely labels, they were part of the story's interpretive machinery. The multiplicity of versions reveals the vitality of ancient storytelling. No single Gilgamesh text claims ultimate authority. Instead, different tablets emphasize different episodes, and each version speaks to a particular need or moment. Sometimes the king is a builder and lawgiver, sometimes he is a lover, or a seeker, or a man undone by loss. That flexibility is a strength. It allowed the figure of Gilgamesh to remain relevant across changing political and religious landscapes. As you listen, remember that these myths grew from human voices shaped by daily concerns, droughts and harvests, floods and sieges, births and deaths. The poet who first formed Gilgamesh from the raw material of memory and hope may have been inspired by a real ruler, but the result was a figure who transcended any single life. In the end, Gilgamesh is an invention meant to help people think about what matters most when power confronts mortality. The story's endurance lies partly in its refusal to simplify. It offers no clean victory over death, no permanent immunity to human frailty. Instead, it proposes a mixed legacy: build well, rule justly, love deeply, and make sure your city and story endure. For the Sumerians, these were not abstract guidelines but practical counsel embedded in myth. To hear Gilgamesh's origin is to hear a civilization instructing itself. Today, when archaeologists and translators piece together fragments of clay, they participate in a long conversation that links us to those ancient listeners. Each tablet is a voice from the past asking to be heard, each line a thread connecting present questions of power and mortality to those of a people who lived by rivers and prayed to gods with human temperaments. Gilgamesh's origin, therefore, is not merely a tale from long ago, it is an ongoing dialogue about what it means to be human. And so the story continues to travel, moving across languages, through editions, into the hands of readers and listeners who find in Gilgamesh their own reflections. His origins in Sumerian myths remain a powerful foundation, a meeting point of history and narrative imagination. As long as people gather to ask who will outlast them and what kind of life is worth living, the echoes of Gilgamesh will not fade from memory. The story begins before language had settled into ink on clay, when storytellers walked from town to town carrying fragments of a king who was more god than man and less man than legend. In the marketplace their words rose and fell like the river, sometimes a roar about a ruler's cruelty, sometimes a softer current about a man's loneliness. Each telling left fingerprints on the tale, and the earliest outlines of Gilgamesh took shape around what he was denied as much as around what he possessed. The need for a companion became the hinge on which the character turned, and the world listened as the answer took shape in the wilderness outside the city walls. In the city of Uruk, the walls were famed and the city gate a subject of pride, but the king was restless. He was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a paradox that made him both powerful and incomplete. Men and women told of his great works and of nights that stretched long with a sense of unsatisfied yearning. The tale needed a counterweight, a being who would mirror Gilgamesh's force with a different kind of origin, and so the idea grew of one shaped by nature, not palace. Enkidu was first imagined as a creature of the steppe in the marsh, clothed in hair and running with wild beasts. He moved with the animals, drank from the same waters, and lacked the structured language of cities. This contrast with Gilgamesh set the stage for a collision of worlds, the civilized and the unrefined, the cultivated mind and an instinctive body. It was natural, then, that storytellers made Enkidu both a foil and a complement, for in that encounter the human drama could unfold with all its tensions and reconciliations. The tales tell of the hunter who saw tracks unlike any he had known, of sturdy prints that marred the cunning of snares, of a man who freed trapped beasts as if kin. He brought the tale into court and the elders ordered a trap of their own, concerned that their flocks and livelihoods were threatened. This hunter's report became the vector by which the city intervened with the wilderness, and the narrative began to close the distance between two lives moving toward one another. To make the bridge, the chorus needed a woman whose presence could alter destiny, and the courtesan Shamhat was given that weighty task. Shamhat's role unfolds not as seduction for seduction's sake but as social initiation, as an act that tethers a wild body to culture. The ritual of her staying with Enkidu for days is described in gentle, insisting sentences in the ancient lines, a time that softens fur and sharpens thought. It was through her that Enkidu learned to eat bread and drink beer, to wear garments and listen to the rhythms of the marketplace. These changes were not merely external, they translated into consciousness, and the reader feels the movement from instinct to memory, from appetite to reflection. When Enkidu approaches Uruk for the first time, he is struck by the walls and by the presence of Gilgamesh himself. The epic frames this meeting with the charge of destiny, two forces aimed squarely at one another by the world's needs. Each character carries authority of different kinds, Gilgamesh the ruler, Enkidu the unclaimed force of nature. Their initial meeting is electric, not yet friendship but the essential drama of recognition, the sense that each has met an equal and a question. The encounter on Enkidu's side is raw and unmediated, astonishment at human artifice, curiosity about the rituals of a city that flows like a controlled river. For Gilgamesh there is the mirror of his loneliness suddenly cracked by a being who will not bow to his usual prerogatives. The tension escalates to a contest of strength, and in that contest the epic authors teach the listener about boundaries and equality. The fight is not merely physical but moral and dramaturgical, it must be seen as the door to a deeper union. They wrestle fiercely, and the strain of muscle and breath becomes a language. Each blow is a stanza, each catch a refrain, and the listener's sympathies slide between them as the balance shifts. When the match ends, it is not with vanquishing but with recognition. In exhausting one another they reveal that what they share is too strong for warfare to contain. The fight opens into a conversation, which is how the narrative shifts from conflict into fellowship. After the dust settles, the two men sit and speak, and their conversation stitches the epic together. They exchange stories, and through this exchange they learn to name each other's strengths and fears. Enkidu confesses his life among animals and his sudden awareness of vulnerability, while Gilgamesh admits the weight of empire and the emptiness that sometimes comes with it. In these admissions, the tale discovers tenderness, and the listener perceives the softening of a ruler and the civilized enlargement of a wild heart. From their union springs partnership, and the epic's shape becomes clearer as joint exploits are planned and performed. They set their sights on the cedar forest, a place that in the story stands for the mysterious otherworld beyond human rule. The journey to the forest functions like a rite of passage, testing their courage and solidifying their bond. The narrative moves from intimate confession to shared purpose, and in doing so it demonstrates how companionship transforms both men into something larger than themselves. On the road to the cedar forest, their preparations are described with a clarity that underscores ritual and intention. They gird themselves with gear and resolve, and there are moments when small details, the setting of a strap, the offering to a shrine, reveal the seriousness of the task. The world around them is attentive, birds notice, rivers remember, and even the stones learn the weight of their footsteps. These details remind the listener that myths are rooted in lived habit as much as in the miraculous. The guardian of the forest, Humbaba, is presented as a force of primeval power, and the stakes rise beyond personal glory toward cosmic balance. Humbaba's roar is described so that the listener can imagine the sound pressing against the chest, and the trees themselves seem to hold their breath. The heroism required to confront such a being is not merely strength, but a will to break with ordinary bounds, a willingness to risk one's identity for a story larger than self. Through this confrontation, the epic teaches about limits and courage in a language that allows every listener to picture the scene. When they meet Humbaba, fear is a real and necessary ingredient, colored by awe. The lines suggest that terror and reverence can coexist, and the narrative uses that coexistence to complicate its heroes so they are not mere machines of conquest. Enkidu, whose first life belonged to the wild, feels the weight of this unnatural intrusion into a sacred grove, and his hesitation humanizes the campaign in a way that simple triumph could not. This internal conflict allows the tale to interrogate the justice of humankind's imposition on nature. The killing of Humbaba does not land as an easy moral yes, and the epic registers that complexity in the survivor's later misgivings. There is celebration, of course, for the feat brings back cedar and renown, yet later passages remind the reader that acts of destruction have echoes. This ambivalence is one of the epic's masterstrokes. It resists neat moral closure and instead asks the listener to hold contradiction in the heart. The audience is thus invited to look at both the grandeur and the cost. They return to Uruk with spoils and stories, and the city's response is jubilant. Statues and songs mark their success, and for a time the pair are untroubled and admired. But even within celebration there are seeds of trouble, for the gods watch and for the gods have expectations of balance and respect. The story builds these moments as rhythmic checks and balances that remind listeners the human realm is nested within a larger moral universe. Ishtar, the goddess of both love and war, notices Gilgamesh's sunlit fame and turns her attention toward him, offering a union that is both an honor and a test. Gilgamesh refuses, drawing on his authority as king and on an instinct not to be owned by a god's caprice. In wrath, Ishtar sends the bull of heaven, a creature of destructive force intended to punish Gilgamesh and to humble the arrogance of mortals. The narrative here uses divine reaction to frame human action, showing how one decision reverberates upward as well as down. The battle with the bull of heaven is staged as a cosmic contest against a force that tears at fields and families and threatens the balance of life. Enkidu and Gilgamesh fight as a pair, their synchronization sharpened since the forest trial. The bull is slain, but the deed tightens the cosmic weave. Killing a sacred beast brings consequences, and the gods debate the fate of those who would defy divine will. The epic's tension thickens, and the listener feels the inevitable gravity of inevitable retribution. The god's judgment falls hard in the person of Enkidu, who becomes the victim of a sentence that reads like a moral law, The companion who shared in transgression must pay the price. Enkidu's illness is detailed with slow, aching focus so that the listener experiences the ebb of life in a way that feels intimate and immediate. Dreams and omens begin to crowd the narrative, each one a voice from beyond the human capacity to control. In Enkidu's weakening, the story pulls back the curtain on mortality and suffering. Enkidu's death is a turning point that transforms the epic from a tale of heroic enterprise into a meditation on loss and the human condition. Gilgamesh's grief is volcanic, reshaping his priorities and compelling him onto a quest of a different sort, a search for immortality. The text lingers on gestures of mourning, on wailing, on the ritual of burial, and through those gestures it renders the universality of sorrow. This is where the personal becomes archetypal, and the listener recognizes the echo of their own losses. The stories of the tavern and the counselor, of the mother and the king, unfold now as reflections on legacy and memory. Gilgamesh tries to bargain with the gods, to find a loophole or an elixir that will undo the finality that has entered his life. The epic explores these attempts with a humane curiosity, showing both the nobility and the futility of seeking to outrun death. In the process, the text reveals how friendships can rearrange a life and set new trajectories toward wisdom. Later versions of the tale, copied onto clay by scribes who thought in lists of signs and in the geometry of the wedge-shaped mark, adjusted and refined these moments. Each tablet carries the imprint of its maker, and every repetition in the mouth of a bard sharpened phrases and extended scenes. The encounter with Enkidu thus exists not only in story but in a history of storytelling, where additions and omissions tell us as much about the listeners as about the characters. This metalayer gives the epic a palimpsest quality, and the listener can sense generations leaning in to alter tone and emphasis. Scholars found fragments in different cities and different languages, and in piecing them together they learned that the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu was the core that made all retellings coherent. Some versions place more emphasis on the wilderness origins, others on the royal duties, yet the friendship remains the spine that holds the variance in harmonic relation. That durability speaks to a deep human recognition, that companionship changes the shape of our stories and carries our meaning forward. It is this recognition that perhaps made the tale resonate across centuries. The composition of the epic likely involved many hands and voices, each contributing verses or episodes as they saw fit, yet the encounters with Enkidu feel remarkably consistent. They are scenes that listeners wanted again and again, the wild man tamed, the fight that turns into embrace, the journey that tests friendship, and the death that teaches the survivor. The sequence forms an emotional architecture that predisposes the narrative towards certain musical cadences, where breath and pause become as important as action. Storytellers use these cadences to guide the audience through grief's peaks and troughs. Enkidu functions in the epic as both mirror and conscience, reflecting Gilgamesh's excesses and asking questions the king could not have faced alone. He enacts a challenge to authority while also offering loyalty that undercuts isolation. In that duality, the listener perceives a compressed history of human society's transition from common life into hierarchy, and the epic holds that social memory within intimate interaction. It thus reads as a document of human evolution disguised as drama. Interpretations through time have enlarged the figure of Enkidu beyond his initial role, coloring him with symbolic freight that varies with each culture that inherits the tale. Some traditions see him as humanity's wild origins domesticated by culture, others as the spirit of nature given speech and pathos. The elasticity of his character is testimony to the story's capacity to host many meanings without collapsing. Each listener, each culture, finds in Enkidu some reflection of its own anxieties and aspirations. As the epic traveled in the mouths of storytellers, through courtyards, under lamps, across caravans, the encounter sequences provided dependable emotional anchors. Audiences learned the rhythm of those scenes and returned to them like pilgrims to a shrine, each person bringing new reactions that in turn shaped subsequent retellings. This dynamic interaction between teller and audience is part of how the epic takes shape, accreting layers like a river depositing silt. The narrative is therefore alive, a conversation stretched through centuries. In performance, the meeting scenes could be stretched into long negotiations or compacted into a single blow, depending on the teller's aim. A storyteller might dwell on the smell of the marsh around Enkidu or on the flash of Gilgamesh's armor to suit the mood of the night. Those choices subtly altered the moral center of the tale, accentuating either the loss or the triumph. This mutability made the epic a living thing, adapted to teach, to warn, or to console according to the needs of its audience. Enkidu's death also provided ritual words that could be used to initiate communal mourning, and these phrases became mnemonic devices that marked transitions between scenes and later transcriptions. They worked like signposts in memory, enabling listeners to remember long sequences and to identify the story's high points. In an oral culture, those repeated formulas were essential, and in the written tablets they preserved a sense of voice that otherwise might have dissolved. Through them, the cadences of encounter and loss remained, echoing in the clay for millennia. The way the epic treats friendship influenced broader traditions of companionship in the ancient Near East and beyond. Later heroes and other stories carry traces of Enkidu as companion, shadow, or conscience, and the archetype spreads like light through overlapping tales. This cross-pollination is one of the reasons the Gilgamesh narrative remains important. It shows how certain relational patterns embed themselves in cultures and then re-emerge in altered forms. The initial encounters between king and wild man became a template for ethical partnership. Examining the poetry of the scenes, one notices the economy of images that nonetheless accumulate into an emotionally full picture. Simple objects, a piece of bread, a tangle of hair, the smell of cedar resin, acquire symbolic heft through repetition. The narrative chooses small, vivid details rather than long expositions, and through this choice it makes each encounter feel immediate and personal. The careful listener will notice how the smallest sensory note can pivot the meaning of an entire episode. Thematically, the encounters with Enkidu push the epic into territories of identity and self-making. Gilgamesh learns to soften without losing kingly stature, and Enkidu acquires language and reflection without surrendering his core. Their friendship models a synthesis rather than an erasure, suggesting that human flourishing arises when disparate strengths are recognized and integrated. The story therefore becomes less about heroic dominance and more about mutual transformation. The epic's use of repetition and variation in the encounter sequences also invites reflection on memory and the act of remembering. Phrases recur with small shifts in tense or emphasis, and the cumulative effect is like the way grief circles a subject, returning to it again and again from slightly different angles. That technique allows listeners to feel the pressure of time and the unwillingness of the mind to forget. It is a literary mirror of personal mourning, the way memory returns to certain pivotal interactions and reconfigures them. Later audiences have read the episodes as moral parable and psychological portrait, and both readings are sustained by the text's richness. The narrative contains teachings about humility and respect, warning against reckless destruction, but it also offers a nuanced study of human attachment and loss. The depth of its characters is what gives the moral lessons their power, because we care for people more than we do for abstract commandments. The encounters with Enkidu thus teach through feeling as much as through precept. The transmission of the epic into written form required decisions about what to include and how to order episodes, and those editorial choices shaped the modern imagination of the encounters. Scribes chose variant lines, sometimes plumping dialogue, sometimes trimming descriptions to fit the space of clay. Each tablet thus became a curated edition, and our modern reconstructions are mosaics of those curations. Knowing this invites the listener to imagine multiple possible versions and to appreciate the story as composite and plural. The friendship's end forces Gilgamesh into a quest that concerns every listener, the attempt to cross the final border of death. In that journey, the earlier encounters with Enkidu are the map and the fuel. Without that bond, Gilgamesh would not have left his walls. The loss converts companionship into motivation, and the epic transforms personal sorrow into existential inquiry. The listener feels the shift toward inward searching as action becomes reflection. To sit with this epic in the present is to inherit a long conversation about how humans make meaning together. The encounters with Enkidu teach that tales are social artifacts, forged in dialogue and polished by retelling. They show how personal relationships can stand in for cultural transitions, and how intimacy between two figures can encode questions about mortality, justice, and the human place in the cosmos. For anyone listening on a journey, the story offers not only entertainment but companionship in its own right. As the narrative winds through grief and quest, the figures of Gilgamesh and Enkidu remain living presences on the page and in the ear. Their meetings, fights, jokes, and moments of care are recorded with a lyrical precision that rewards careful attention. The listener is invited to follow the contours of their bond, to notice the little acts that compile into loyalty, and to regard the eventual rupture as both tragic and transformative. The epic thus teaches the shape of feeling as it teaches the shape of story. Over centuries, the meetings between king and wild man have been painted, translated, and reimagined, and each version carries a new inflection. Modern readers find in their encounters reflections of contemporary dilemmas, power and restraint, technology and wildness, friendship across difference. That timelessness is part of the tale's magic. A scene on a clay tablet can still teach a driver on a highway or a person sitting by a window about the necessities of companionship. The narrative continues to do what it did first, to bring a world into intimate focus through the prism of a meeting. Even as archaeology recovers more fragments, the core encounter scenes remain curiously whole, as if all time conspires to keep their essence intact. The continuity suggests that certain human experiences resist erasure: the surprise of meeting an equal, the slow building of trust, the shock of unexpected loss. Those are the pieces that listeners find themselves returning to as if to test the durability of feeling across millennia. The epic survives because those experiences are shared across every generation. Listening closely to the epic's encounter scenes, one hears a chorus of voices: the original teller, the responding audience, the later scribe, the translator who renders old words into new. Those layers do not dilute the story but enrich it, like adding more strings to an instrument so its tone deepens. In the meeting between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, then, we do not have a single story but a gathering of stories that together teach how to be human. Their encounters continue to instruct, to console, and to inspire, echoing into the present with the simple demand that we notice one another. In the beginning there is always the sound of the city, a steady human tide washing over stone and clay, and in that sound the name Gilgamesh rises like the echo of a drum. He stands at the heart of Uruk, taller than most men, broader than the gate, his shadow sweeping the courtyards like a proclamation. People tell stories about the hours he spends constructing walls and temples, about his hands that mark and measure, but his greatness is not only in brick and mortar, it is in desire, an appetite that does not easily find satisfaction. It makes him restless, a king who seeks not just to rule his city but to leave a mark that will outlast reign and rust and rumor. The restlessness of a ruler is a dangerous thing when it cannot find a worthy shape, and so it seeks trials. Gilgamesh learns to hunger for more than feasts and festivals, for to be remembered he believes one must carve one's name into the world. That hunger draws him into confrontation, and confrontation draws him into the wild places of map and myth. It sets him on a path that will stretch from the cultivated lands of men into the whispering, dark green of the cedar forest. At first, the cedar forest is an idea, romantic and distant, a place spoken of in traders' tales as if it were located at the edge of dreams. They say its trees are taller than houses, their trunks like columns of the sky, their scent a resinous perfume that clings to the throat. They say these trees are guarded by a primeval force, Humbaba, appointed by the gods to bar men from the heart of the wood. The name itself feels heavy in the mouth, a syllable of awe and warning that does not belong to the market square. Gilgamesh hears the descriptions and goes. He does not go alone because he cannot trust himself not to overwhelm what he sees with only his will. At his side stands Enkidu, born from clay and the breath of the gods, wild in the beginning and human by degrees. Their friendship begins in a contest of strength and evolves into a fellowship tempered by shared laughter and shared grief. He who would otherwise be a solitary conqueror needs another to measure himself by. Their approach to the cedar is marked by a drop in temperature and brightness, as if the forest kept its own light separate from the sun. Dawn slips over the canopy in soft, green washes, turning leaves into coins and making the path seem like a thread of light. They smell pine and sap and a damp sweetness that is almost metallic, and every step is accompanied by a chorus of insects and distant, suspicious calls of birds. With each farther step, the city sinks from memory, the shape of the citadel, the clink of the potter's wheel, the names of people who call them king and friend, these things fade as if covered by moss. They proceed with careful strategy but also a hunger that is almost theological. The plan is not merely to cut trees but to confront the sacred power that prevents men from taking what they desire. In their quarrel with the forest, they are quarreling with the boundary the gods have placed between the human and the divine. It is a sacramental test. To succeed, they must prove their worth, their courage, and their reverence, and also their willingness to transgress boundaries when fate demands it. Humbaba's presence is not immediate. First, there are signs, trees felled by something larger than human hands, the breath of the earth itself shifting underfoot, and a hush that falls over the birds when they pass. The forest seems to hold itself in a long, taut moment, as if inhaling before a thunder. The brothers of step and dust press forward with the weight of purpose, and the tension is a living thing that binds their shoulders and quickens their blood. When they finally see Humbaba, he is not the monstrous caricature of tavern talk. He is vast, a being of layered existence, skin braided like bark, facial features both ancient and uncountable. His mouth is a cave and his eyes are ember bright. Those eyes see centuries and judge in a manner that is not easily moved. There is an air of judgment around him, as if every tree and root around him is an extension of his attention. The first exchange is not words but assessments. Humbaba issues a cry that sounds like forest thunder, and Gilgamesh and Enkidu answer with sharpened wooden spears and bronze that gleams like dry lightning. They circle, and the forest listens. Gilgamesh feels absurdly young in that moment and yet gifted with a clarity that frightens him, the knowledge that one act can tilt the world's balance, that a swung axe can rearrange fate's ledger. Combat in that place is not leisure but sacrament. They do not merely strike, they name one another's courage. Enkidu moves with a speed and instinct that reads like a revelation. Gilgamesh strikes with precision and force, each blow a ruler's command, each parry a prayer. The air is thick with dust and resin, and the sounds of struggle mingle with the groans of the trees themselves, as if they protest or applaud depending on the breath of fate. When Humbaba falters, there is a moment of tenderness, impossible and sharp. For a creature that embodies the forest's ancient sovereignty, he pleads in a voice that suddenly sounds like wind through the cedar fronds. He offers to yield, to become a guardian in another form, to spare them if they will only show mercy. That appeal splits the two friends. Enkidu is moved, Gilgamesh is not. held fast by a resolve to carve his name where the godly names lay thickest. There arises the tension between compassion and ambition, and it is the most human of struggles. Gilgamesh thinks of walls and written lists, of boasting lines that will chant his name for generations. Enkidu thinks of balance and of the innocence of the forest. He imagines a world where man and tree are not enemies. Their argument is short, because the moment itself has gravity, but in that brevity lie lifetimes, choices are made, and a future is closed down like a book. They take Humbaba's head, the act sudden and brutal and full of a grim kind of ceremonial necessity. The head is more than a token, it is a shifting of power, a monument that they intend to bring back to Uruk. When they sail away with the gift, the forest's mood seems to invert from a mournful hymn to a curious observation, as if lost things have been carried away and the world is adjusting. Gilgamesh drinks in triumph and a cold spark of fear, for he knows that to defy the gods invites consequence beyond the reach of spear and wall. Back in Uruk, the people celebrate as though a famine has been lifted. The head of Humbaba is laid out like a trophy, and for a moment the city's praises feel like a balm to the king's unrest. But triumph breeds attention in all directions. News carries. The heavens keep their accounts in ways men cannot sense, and Ishtar, goddess of love and war, watches and weighs the deed with a calculus known only to immortals. Ishtar's reaction is not the soft reply of a distant lover. She is affronted, not simply by the killing of the guardian, but by what it says, that men dare to seize domains the gods have set aside. In her displeasure there is a personal sting, for she sees Gilgamesh not only as a trespasser but as a suitor who has refused her advances. Her reproach doubles the stakes, it is wrath given texture and form. She sends the bull of heaven, a creature of tempest, hunger, and the raw force of drought and storm blended into an animal made for calamity. The bull bears the scent of thunder and the smell of a sky torn open, and its footsteps cause the plain to cough up dust and fear. When it lowers its head and charges, fields curl into themselves, and houses shudder like ships in a gale. It is not merely a beast but a natural disaster given shape and intent. Gilgamesh and Enkidu confront the bull in a theater of plowed earth and penance. The city gathers, and the air tastes of oil, sweat, and the metallic promise of blood. The two friends arrange themselves as if for some sacred duet, and their cooperation is now honed by the earlier trial. They have learned not only to measure strength but to trust. Their dance with the bull is swift and brutal, ropes tighten, horns scrape, and Enkidu leaps as if to meet the animal's own violence with similar abandon. During the fight, the celestial and the earthly collide. Dust rises in great clouds like a second storm, and the bull's bellow is a confluence of thunder and famine that passes through people like a rumor. It stamps gardens flat, striking at the sustenance of the city. It signals how thin the margin is between human triumph and collective ruin. Each snort and swing is a test of will, for if the bull prevails, the consequences will be practical and existential, bread and memory both at risk. When they at last bring the bull down, silence is immediate and very loud. Horns and hooves still twitch, the sound of a wound settling into silence, and the city breathes out as if it had been holding its breath for an age. The victory is complete and yet uneasy, like the taste of salt in a sweet wine. Ishtar does not cease with a bruise to pride, her anger deepens, and in her grief she finds a new petition to the gods. The gods convene in high places where mortals cannot follow, and their judgments have a weight that could reshape fates. They look on the two friends who have slain their appointed agents and confer about justice. In these councils mortals appear as lessons, their deeds interpreted as images in a much larger narrative. The consequence the gods bring is not immediate thunder but a subtler sorrow. Enkidu's life will be taken, not in a battlefield blaze but in decline, as a punishment that reads like a moral fable. Enkidu's illness is long and poignant, a slow unspooling of vigor that forces both men to reckon with mortality. Gilgamesh watches his companion change from a creature of raw strength into something thinner and more human-shaped by pain and reflection. Enkidu speaks of the wild things he once loved and the domesticated life he has chosen, and his words are layered with regrets and with gratitude. There is a beauty in those exchanges, small and luminous as the light on a river at dawn, and in them Gilgamesh learns the most costly lesson of all: the world takes as much as it grants. The death of Enkidu is an earthquake inside Gilgamesh. It is relentless, and it rewrites his ambitions into questions. He had sought fame to escape death's finality, yet fame does not bring the living back. In the fog of grief, he becomes a traveler haunted by faces that no longer answer, and the city he rules seems thinner, as though its walls can no longer hold the shape of his purpose. His journey becomes inward as much as outward. He seeks not only monstrous beings to defeat, but knowledge of that last door no sword can open. Thinking back to Humbaba and the bull, the acts that once seemed trophies now look like barometers of hubris. The killing of the guardian and the overthrow of the bull mark the pivot from human arrogance to human humility, and Gilgamesh must face a new knowledge, that to be great is to be vulnerable. He begins to understand in small, painful increments that strength without restraint gives birth to ruin. The city celebrates and the gods judge, and in between those events men like him must live with what remains. The cedar forest reappears in memory with the smell of resin and the sound of the wind through broken branches. The trees might grow again and they might not. Nature is both resilient and wounded. Humbaba's absence leaves a vacancy, and the world shifts to fill what has been carved away. This is the painful calculus of human intervention. Creation and destruction spiral into one another, each act preparing the ground for future acts that cannot be predicted. Ishtar's fury also becomes part of public memory, an invisible presence that people sense in omens and in the trembling of cattle. The bull of heaven does not return, but its shape lingers in the way people look at the sky when drought comes or when men quarrel. When a goddess is insulted, her energy survives as a cautionary tale, and the city learns to balance celebration with humility. In public rite and private thought, the tale of the bull acquires the flavor of a moral aphorism: do not invite the wrath of powers you cannot command. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu remains the lodestar of the story, even as it becomes recontextualized by loss. Their intimacy was born in physicality and in contest, and it matured into mutual recognition. One learns to see the other not as an adjunct to greatness but as a mirror and corollary. In Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh sees his own finitude reflected back with unbearable clarity. That recognition is the starting point of a king's transformation from sovereign to seeker. In the years that follow, Gilgamesh continues to build and to measure, but there is now an inward tempering to his projects. He invests not only in walls but in stories, and songs that will keep memory alive for a time longer than the stones. He consults sages and wanders towards remote places in pursuit of wisdom about death, not driven by victory but by a desire to understand what it would mean to make peace with the unknown. His later life is a mixture of governance and pilgrimage, of proclamations and quiet nights when the city seems to breathe with him. The saga of Humbaba and the bull also becomes a lens through which later generations read law and piety. Priests tell the story to children in tones that vary between dread and wonder, making the two episodes into cautionary scriptures: respect the sacred boundaries, and beware the consequences of courting the divine. Artisans carve the scenes upon cylinder seals, and the images become compact retellings of the moral and the dramatic. Over time, the tales accrue interpretive layers, each culture and each teller calibrating the moral edges to fit their need. Scholars, had they existed in that immediate age, would note how those myths negotiate the tension between human enterprise and cosmic order. They would trace themes of hubris, friendship, the sacredness of nature, female divine agency, and the inevitability of death, showing how the story reaches across the centuries. But even without academic apparatus, the plain truth is evident. These episodes are less about monsters and more about the human heart confronting limits. They remain compelling because they speak to something every listener recognizes: ambition tempered by loss. Imagine hearing the story now, while driving a road that carves through a landscape of modernity. The image of cedars taller than houses can translate into the sight of skyscrapers. Humbaba's guardianship becomes the unspoken rules that keep cities livable. The bull of heaven can become any force that capriciously upends daily life: a storm, a market crash, an argument that spirals into divorce. The ancient tale adapts because its core is human experience, and listeners in any age find their own edges reflected in its contours. Beyond the allegory, there is also the tactile pleasure of detail: the scrape of bronze, the smell of cedar oil, the weight of a trophy head in a king's hands. Such sensory bits make the ancient feel immediate, and they anchor the moral abstractions in flesh. The narrative uses the body exactly to map the moral landscape: wounds and feasts, sleep and wakefulness, the slow wasting away of a great friend. Those elements give the story its staying power because they place the intellect inside the world of sensation. The telling of these trials over time also shows how stories become cultural technology, tools used to shape behavior and imagination. Whatever his original context, the story of Gilgamesh functions like a parable about leadership. Leadership requires more than muscle, it requires temperance and memory. The consequences of ignoring that lesson are not always immediate or obvious, but they accumulate like the deadwood of a hillside until the slope gives way. The tale thus operates as a collective memory mechanism, a way for societies to encode wisdom using drama and pain. In artistic retellings, the interplay between the two fights is often foreground. The cedar episode typifies a confrontation with the wild, the unknown exterior, whereas the bull episode brings the transgression into the civic sphere, creating a public crisis with divine overtones. Artists play with pacing and emphasis. Some give us the forest as a place of loss and sanctuary, others dwell on the political ramifications of inviting divine wrath. Each retelling emphasizes slightly different moral chords, but all agree on the fundamental intimacy between extraordinary deeds and their hidden costs. The architecture of the myth also invites reflection on what constitutes courage. Is courage the willingness to swing an axe at a creature like Humbaba, or is it the courage to say no when the gods' favors are offered at the price of human dignity? Is it the bravery of facing a bull that stomps up dust like a small apocalypse, or is it the bravery of mourning and changing afterwards? The story's power lies in posing such questions without offering easy answers, forcing listeners to squint at their own lives for parallels. Different cultures and epics have seized on those ambiguities to tell their own versions. Some see in Gilgamesh an archetypal hero, a prototype for later figures who boast and repent in turn. Others interpret Enkidu as the personification of nature who enters human society and suffers domestication's costs. Yet another strain reads the goddess Ishtar as a complex figure blending creation and destruction, a reminder that power, even when attractive, can be terrifying if crossed. The multiplicity of interpretations is a testament to the story's layered design. The psychological texture of the episodes is equally rich. Humans like story because stories let us rehearse fear and desire in safety, and the trials of Gilgamesh provide an intense rehearsal. We can feel the exhilaration of glory and then the ache of loss without risking our own lives. That vicarious processing helps communities rehearse ethical outcomes. We watch kings and gods and beasts so we can decide how to act when our own lives press hard against moral choice. The rituals and symbols the story contains have also influenced real-world practices. The idea of naming in memory is crucial. Gilgamesh's longing for an enduring name manifests physically in his building, and metaphysically in the songs that retell his deeds. Societies have used monuments and monuments in the mind as insurance against oblivion, and the epic gives us an archetypal narrative to explain why such obsessions arise. Memory itself becomes an axis around which power and mortality swivel, clarifying why people prize legacy so unevenly and passionately. Beyond moral and psychological readings, there is the matter of language and cadence. The story's sentences and repeating motifs make it suitable for oral performance. A narrator can linger on the sounds of the forest, speed through the panic of the bull, or lower the voice when the gods meet. The aesthetic pleasure of such performances is not incidental, it is how the tale spreads and survives. Rhythm shapes memory, and a well-told tale lodges like a seed in listeners' minds. Modern retellings often aim to reconcile the ancient with the contemporary, to make the myths speak to present concerns like environmental stewardship or the ethics of power. The killing of Humbaba, in some modern frames, becomes a parable about deforestation and ecological hubris. The Bull of Heaven can be read as a metaphor for climate backlash or for political consequences of disrespecting institutions. These framings keep the story alive, showing that ancient tales can be retrofitted to the pressing anxieties of any era. Even so, there is also a caution against reductive readings that siphon all mystery out of the tale. The myth resists being flattened into a single lesson. Its richness lies in contradiction, in the way glory and ruin live in the same act. A storyteller who pretends to hold the final key to its meaning risks turning a living thing into a museum piece. Better to let the narrative hold multiple truths at once, as if it were a gem that flashes different colors depending on the angle. Listening to the story, one can derive practical reflections without stripping away its wonder. Leadership demands humility because power without self-knowledge leads to devastation, and friendship matters because bonds humanize aims that would otherwise grow cold and absolute. Nature deserves respect, because its guardianship is woven into the fabric of existence, and the divine can be capricious, requiring both reverence and courage in equal measure. These takeaways do not exhaust the tale, but they make it useful for the living work of being human. Over time, the tale gathers pilgrimage, commentary, and ritual accretions that further enrich its significance. People create shrines and moments of remembrance that echo the king's work of building memory, making the epic itself part of a culture's civic architecture. Even in the marketplace, phrases from the story become idiomatic, shorthand for complex situations. In that way, myth functions as public vocabulary, helping communities argue about values using common metaphors. The story's endurance is another wonder to note, how a composition from clay and breath can outlast empires, how images made for ancient listeners can still rouse a modern audience. It proves something about humanity's hunger for tales, for moral rehearsal, and for the comfort that comes from shared myth. These ancient episodes, once spoken aloud around fires or under tiled roofs, have become a kind of connective tissue across centuries, a human artifact of memory and aspiration. And so the trials of Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven remain more than curiosities of an old age. They are living narratives that continue to be told, reshaped, and internalized. They offer drama, grief, triumph, and moral paradox in measures suited to every year. To hear them is to sit across time from people who once worried and loved and feared in much the same terms we do now. What remains, finally, is not an easy moral but the impression of a story that holds space for the complexity of life. It teaches that acts have consequences that ripple outward, that friendship can redeem and humanize, and that the divine might love as it punishes. Those are hard lessons and soft consolations at once, suitable for the long road and the late hour when thoughts grow large and language becomes the only faithful companion. When dawn first silvered the ziggurats of Uruk, the city woke not simply as a cluster of houses but as a living claim of stone and song. Gilgamesh strode through its gates like a question posed aloud, his presence both a promise and a challenge. People paused in the market stalls and by the canals, sensing the king's mood as if it were weather. He wore his authority like a mantle and his restlessness like a second skin, neither easily removed. He had known triumph early, with victories that became the kinds of tales mothers hummed to their children. Yet triumph had its hollows, and even in the acme of power there are nights when a king counts the cost of mastery. Those nights grew longer for Gilgamesh, threaded with a shadow he refused to name at first. He moved through festivals and councils with an air of impatience, as if seeking something the city could not give. Then Enkidu arrived like a storm scene from the horizon, wild and elemental, a man made of the steppe and its river grasses. He came from the open place beyond the city's laws, raised by beasts and the wind, ignorant of the smooth rules of courtyards and protocol. When their first meeting cracked like flint, it was not merely a clash of bodies but a collision of need. What began as rivalry became a tether, then a friendship carved hard by combat and laughter and shared wine. Enkidu's laughter was contagious in the way of open fires, bringing warmth and color where there had been only calculated light. He learned the city's ways quickly, but he kept the wild in him like a song that refused to change. With Enkidu at his side, Gilgamesh felt the world larger, as if his steps could carry him beyond the limits of human expectation. They hunted together, built walls together, and slept like two halves of a single dream. They were a pair of sons to the citizens of Uruk, unequal and unrelenting, and their deeds became stories told between the beats of the loam. They felled Humbaba in the cedar forest with oars made of bravery and fear, and they took from a goddess the bull that stamped the earth like thunder. Victory mounted upon victory until the city's elders began to worry that more than enemies would be destroyed by such abandon. But even amid acclaim, Gilgamesh began to notice the small erosions time visited upon flesh and throne. He saw lines on Enkidu's face after their nights of revelry, a tiredness not mollified by sleep. That tiredness caught in the corners of a smile and spread, a quiet contagion. Gilgamesh found himself measuring his friend as if gauging the thickness of a bridge at its middle, afraid of what might break. Then grief arrived like a sudden drought, abrupt and inexorable. Enkidu fell ill and withered in a way the king had no power to staunch. His dreams grew raw with images of lifeless plains and caged birds, and his final words were a lament for lost strength. The funeral left a silence in Uruk that was not the absence of noise but the presence of a hollow that could be walked into. In the aftermath, Gilgamesh's grief sharpened into an obsession with death itself, as if the fact of mortality had been a concealed blade waiting to be felt. He would not accept that the law of soil and bone applied even to him, who ruled with the voice of the gods. He began to pace the city's walls at night, watching the river's slow progress and thinking of the river as a thing that swallowed names. The loss of Enkidu made him look at his own life as if it were a fragile vessel bobbing on unknown waters. So began his quest that was not merely for an answer but for an escape. He sought a way to outrun the inevitable, to find a shore beyond the reach of time's tide. Such longing can twist a man outward into the world and inward into myth at once. This yearning made him brave and foolish in equal measure, and it set his feet toward lands older than the songs told in Uruk's taverns. He left the city with a retinue that watched him go like a sun dipping. The road took him beyond familiar fields and into a landscape where trees were not ornamental but spiritual, where mountains were anchors for the sky. The people they passed offered prayers that mixed caution and hope, for a king who walked toward immortality was both a beacon and a hazard. Gilgamesh listened less to prayers than to a gnawing emptiness that still echoed with the sound of Enkidu's absence. His first great trial came at the edge of the cedar forest, a place half legend, half living air. It was a place where timber grew tall as temples and where the spirits of the wood were said to whisper to those who entered. There he had once met Humbaba and won through force, but now he sought not glory but counsel. The forest seemed to understand the difference and received him with a muted sort of attention. Then he sailed further and farther, crossing seas that broke with voices and visiting cities whose roofs held other people's names. Each shore brought a new picture of human life, births and bargains, old men telling jokes at the baths, mothers teaching daughters how to set nets. These ordinary rituals pressed on him like reminders. Life was a fabric woven of many hands, and no single thread avoided being cut. The contrast between the small domestic continuity and his personal loss deepened his yearning and complicated it, turning the desire for immortality into a moral examination of worth. In time he heard of Utnapishtim, the one man who had been given immortality by the gods after surviving a flood that reset the world. The story itself was a relief, like finding a single lamp in an immense cave. Gilgamesh dreamed of meeting this living answer, of standing before the man who had cheated finality and asking for the same favor. The journey to find Utnapishtim was long and braided with wonders and terrors, a pilgrimage in which landscapes and interstates mirrored one another. He came finally to the waters that guarded Utnapishtim's house, waters that were not merely physical but moral barriers, testing a traveler's worth. Crossing them required perseverance and the relinquishing of certain comforts, and Gilgamesh met this with both desperation and a strange humility. The journey humbled him in small ways, teaching him the economy of patience and the art of listening when storms were not raging. Each step closer to Utnapishtim lessened a portion of the king's early arrogance. When at last he stood in the presence of Utnapishtim, the immortal man was not a statue but a person who had been remade by catastrophe. His face was etched with the memory of loss as clearly as with memory of survival. Gilgamesh asked bluntly for the secret of everlasting life, and Utnapishtim's reply wove myth with caution. Immortality was not merely a possession to be acquired, but a state heavy with consequence. The story of the flood emerged then, a tale of gods who loved and feared and of human lives swept into a large, terrible recalibration. Utnapishtim told of how the gods once chose to clean the world with floods, and of how he and his wife were saved by a boat built with the geometry of prayer and obedience. He described the afterlife carefully, the thinness of immortality in a world that still demanded attention. He explained that extended life could become a prison if one did not understand the balance between memory and forgetting. His counsel was not denial but a mapping of the trade-offs involved in living forever. Gilgamesh listened with the intensity of one who has seen an entire horizon shift. At moments his eyes burned with the hope that he might swallow the truth and thereby outwit fate. At others, doubt creased his brow, for Utnapishtim's words suggested that eternal life was less a reward and more a realization with its own price. Utnapishtim set a test for Gilgamesh, not to prove cunning but to reveal what kind of man he was beyond titles and force. The test required that Gilgamesh stay awake for a time that felt endless, to prove that he could conquer the most intimate enemy, sleep, the small death that visits all. He failed, as anyone might, for sleep came as an old friend and carried his vigilance along in a single breath. When he woke, the failure stung not because he had been denied an odd victory but because it revealed the limits of sheer will. Utnapishtim laughed softly at human foolishness and then showed another path, a plant that could renew youth, found at the sea's bottom. This plant represented a paradox, a means to cheat the outward signs of age but not the deeper existential truths perhaps. Gilgamesh dove and retrieved it, hands raw from salt and effort, feeling for a moment the fragile exaltation of success. The plant's scent was small and sharp, like a memory of dew, and he cradled it with the fervor of someone who had finally held back time. Returning to Uruk seemed then less like a march home than a procession carrying a new covenant between present and future. But fate remains inventive and sly. While Gilgamesh slept on his return journey, a serpent smelled the plant and stole it, shedding its skin as it slid away. The theft felt personal, as if the world had conspired to deny him the simple rectification of his grief. He woke and found only the empty memory of the plant and the smooth case from which it had come. The loss of that second chance was a wound that did not readily scar. That wound hollowed him in a way deeper than any battle injury. The narrative of his life had been rewound to a scene of impotence, and in that moment he saw how tightly his identity had been knit to success. He had chased the outline of a permanent life and learned instead that some things cannot be bartered away. In his grief and anger there was also a slow dawning. He had been chasing immortality as a remedy for loss, not as an end in itself. His return to Uruk was quieter, marked by a different kind of attention. Where once he had walked as a conqueror, now he walked as a man who had seen the scaffolding of existence. He began to notice the small human economies that made the city live, the patterns of the bread sellers, the cadence of the laborers who repaired roofs, the way children apprenticed to their parents. There was a continuity here that did not require the impossible gift of forever, and this continuity had its own sacredness. He commissioned walls, not for vanity, but as testimony. He wanted to leave something durable that acknowledged human finitude without pretending around it. The walls of Uruk became a record of labor and love, each stone set by hand and named in his mind for the people who had set it. In this way, Gilgamesh turned his desire outward, from the daring attempt to secure his own life forever to a desire to secure a civilization's memory. Another mode of immortality began to shape him, the notion that deeds and works might carry a person's essence beyond their end. Wooden planks and brick and song all became vessels of legacy. He started to listen more closely to the stories of the elders, understanding that history itself is a kind of immortality, not of individual flesh but of influence and trace. He commissioned poets and artists to record not only battles but also the soft hands of mothers and the way the moonlight fell on the riverbank in different seasons. In the streets and workshops, artisans and scribes put their hands to preserving what they could. They recorded Gilgamesh's sorrow not to glorify him but to make sense of it, to allow the city to share in the shaping of a grief that had been too large for any single heart. The poems that grew from this period were not triumphalist, they were inquiry, a communal attempt to place death in conversation with love. This work, humble and exacting, altered how the people of Uruk would think about power and mortality for generations. Gilgamesh himself undertook personal rituals that were not spectacle but practice. He spent mornings sitting by the river, watching the currents erase and redraw small marks in the silt. He learned to read the river as a teacher of patience, and he began to talk to the young men who would one day take his place. He told them less of glory and more of the ethics of responsibility, the duty to tend what was given without claiming to possess it. He also visited the tombs of ancestors, and in those quiet places he found a strange companionship. The names carved on stone were not merely trophies, they were conversations across a divide. He realized that people continued to exist in how they were remembered, and the way their deeds shaped duties and joys. The practice of remembering became a way to honor rather than to escape mortality. At times, the memory of Utnapishtim and the stolen plant returned like a small, sharp ache. He did not fully reconcile with that loss, and perhaps he never would. Some experiences remain as puzzles that sharpen a man's edges without ever being closed. Yet even this lingering did not undo the transformations that had followed his return. If anything, it taught him that some scars are instructive, redirecting energy from futile pursuits to meaningful labors. Gilgamesh eventually developed a new relationship with the gods, one less transactional and more dialogic. He learned that pleading for eternal life was a poor substitute for learning how to live. He began to make offerings not out of fear but out of gratitude, not as a bargain but as recognition that the world had given him a place and that he must make it better. This change was subtle and not always visible to his subjects, but it affected the quality of his decisions. He repaired not only walls but also systems, attending to irrigation and laws and the education of the people. He thought like a steward rather than a ruler in the narrow sense. Stewardship requires humility, a willingness to be small enough to understand need and large enough to plan for those who will do the work tomorrow. The shift in his priorities altered Uruk atom by atom, and over time the city became a living manifestation of those choices. Gilgamesh also engaged in conversations with artisans about what it meant to create things that would endure. They debated the costs of permanence and the ethics of embellishment. Some works were lavish, meant to catch the eye and hold the heart, while others were plain and durable, meant to serve a utilitarian endurance. The king learned that there are many kinds of lastingness, the chapel that survives wars and the loaf that feeds a child. Both have value, and both are fragile in different ways. In quieter moments he would sit with scribes and ask them to record not the victories of war but the small acts of kindness that make a day worth living. He asked that the histories include the names of the workers who built the walls and the women who taught the children how to read the stars. His desire to expand the archive of memory was not merely vanity but an attempt to distribute immortality, to let it rest not only on a throne but on 1,000 ordinary hands. There were nights when dreams returned that were not of Enkidu but of the flood and the boat and the faces of those who had been saved. These were not nightmares so much as the mind's work of knitting together what it had learned. Each dream taught him something different: the fragility of plans, the unpredictability of mercy, the way survival reframes meaning. Waking from these dreams, he felt less like a man chasing an end and more like a person carrying a map drawn in a language he was still learning. He also faced critics, as every leader does, who saw his turn toward care as weakness or distraction. Some began to ask whether a king who spent so much time in reflection could still protect the city. Yet the city's boundaries were not merely military lines but networks of care and commerce that required gentle tending. His critics eventually found the city stronger for his changes, though no victory erased the sting of losing friends or the knowledge of personal limits. Enkidu's absence echoed in unexpected ways, and the way the wind moved through the old grasslands and in the slant of light at certain hours. Gilgamesh would sometimes find himself talking aloud to the empty air, feeling foolish and yet comforted by the act. It is a strange thing to speak into absence and to find it answering, and in those moments he felt less alone. Enkidu's memory became a practice of presence rather than a record of despair. As seasons turned, the city thrummed with births and funerals, each cycle a reminder that life and death were woven together like warp and weft. Gilgamesh found solace in participating in those cycles in ways he had not as a younger man. He attended the births and the weddings and the skillful harvests, recognizing that being present is a kind of reverence. Presence allowed him to live not beyond time but within it with integrity. His transformation did not make him serene in the naive sense, nor did it erase the occasional flash of old impatience. There were days when he missed the taste of conquest and the fierce clarity of immediate danger. But these impulses began to be tempered by an understanding of cost, by a regard for consequences. He no longer sought the infinite as a thing to be taken but as a notion to be embodied through care, memory, and city-making. He encouraged the telling of stories not as propaganda but as a civic act, helping people use narrative to orient themselves in sorrow and joy. The stories recorded tragedies and mundane chores with equal tenderness, believing that each mattered to the fabric of living. Through this, he helped shape a culture that took history as a shared responsibility, not as the private property of rulers. Memory became an act of stewardship rather than a bid for deity. There was, too, an evolution in Gilgamesh's relationship with the gods of the pantheon. He did not renounce them but began to see them less as grantors of singular boons and more as powers that dialogued with human will. He learned to ask questions of them rather than demands, engaging in a subtle diplomacy that acknowledged limits. The gods, in response, seemed to respect the king's altered posture. Their interventions were less about caprice and more about balance. At times his sorrow would sweep him back into introspection, and those were the times when the city's sounds seemed muffled, as if heard underwater. He would walk among the people and then withdraw to think about the long arc of his deeds. Instead of seeking immortality through conquest, he pursued it through the cumulative effect of careful governance. He saw that the persistence of laws, the maintenance of canals, and the training of children were all small immaterial ways to extend influence. Artists painted images of the river as a ribbon that tied generations together, and those images became a metaphor for the city's continuity. Children learned to recite not only battles but also the names of carpenters, midwives, and cooks. The king's reforms had democratized memory and made immortality a distributed, communal thing rather than a solitary reward. In this, Gilgamesh found a consolation deeper than any potion or plant could promise. There were moments of tenderness that marked the end of his long inward journey. He would sit beneath a fig tree with the old and young, and they would ask him about the lessons of his life. He answered plainly that love is not possession, that courage must be guided by wisdom, and that the act of remembering is itself an offering. These conversations were ordinary and extraordinary at once, mundane yet infused with the gravity of his experience. In the twilight of his life, he began to write and commission the writing of not only deeds but reflections. He wanted future generations to read not simply a catalogue of triumphs but a manual for living with loss. He believed that a city strong in memory could teach its citizens how to bear sorrow without being consumed by it. Documenting sorrow became an act of compassion, a way to pass along the craft of mourning. Stories unfold sometimes as closed arcs and sometimes as open ones, and Gilgamesh had come, through many routes, to prefer the latter. He had once wanted to cross the bounds of mortality entirely, but he now understood that permanence is partial and usually collective. He saw that the sweetness of passing is often what gives life its urgency, that the finite horizon imparts colors to days. This realization did not remove the ache but reframed it, allowing him to work with what remained rather than rail against what cannot be reclaimed. He spent his final years encouraging inquiry and artistry, ensuring that the city's knowledge could be passed on. He made space for scholars and for practical laborers, knowing both were necessary. He also made time to laugh, and in laughter he reclaimed part of the youth he had sought in the stolen plant. Joy and sorrow thus coexisted in his days like two threads that together gave fabric its depth. In his last moments, there was no miraculous escape, no sudden lifting into an endless dusk. Instead, there was a steady sense of closure, like the final binding of a book whose pages had been read carefully. He thought of Enkidu and of the plantation stolen by a serpent, and he thought of the stones of Uruk in the children's songs. He had lived through enormous losses and had chosen, in the end, to build rather than to conquer, to remember rather than to vanish into myth. Even after his death, the story continued to live in the city he shaped. The walls he had commissioned stood not only as monuments but as invitations, places where people could gather and tell their stories. The poems and inscriptions preserved a voice that taught humility and encouraged care. Gilgamesh's legacy became less a personal trophy and more a communal inheritance. Generations later, people still sat beneath the fig tree in the market and debated what it means to be mortal and what it means to be remembered. New leaders would rise, some heeding his legacy, others misreading it, and each made their choices with the same human mix of fear and hope. The tales of Gilgamesh were retold not as a map to immortality but as a study of loss and the myriad responses it invokes. The narrative was less about escaping fate and more about learning to shape a life so that it mattered. What endures of Gilgamesh is not an answer but an inquiry. The story offers a mirror rather than a cure. It asks how we will live when faced with those who died before us, and whether we can make room for the small labors that make life meaningful. It does not dismiss the desire to last, but it reframes that desire within a larger ethical and communal project. In listening, one may find not a conclusion but a practice. Loss taught him to recognize the value of ordinary things, a child's laughter, the smell of bread baking, the quiet repairs to a roof after a storm. These small things stitched lives together in ways bigger than ambition could map. He learned that tending these stitches is itself a manner of immortality, for memories carried forward in the lives of others persist in a shape that honors the dead. Such persistence is not forever in the absolute sense, but it is durable and a human one. Gilgamesh's story has kept company with many others across the ages because it attends to the central human question: how should we face the inevitability of endings? The answer it offers is not simple, but it is rich. It suggests that we invest our energies in relationships and institutions that outlive us and that we accept limits as frames within which we can act generously. In this acceptance there is a power that is more lasting than the attempt to evade death. In reflecting on his life, one sees a man who moved from an initial arrogance to an engaged humility, from a solitary hunger for an impossible longevity to a public artistry of care. His journey demonstrates the difference between chasing a boon from above and cultivating a life worth remembering here below. He became a teacher through failure and through sorrow, an example of how to convert private grief into public good. The city became his testament. And so the echoes of his choices ripple outward, teaching us that immortality has many faces. There is the immorality of carved stone and gold, and there is the quieter immortality of a life tending others and preserving truth. Gilgamesh's tale moves us toward the latter, even while acknowledging the ache that prompts the former. It invites listeners to think about their own losses and what they might create in response. If you find yourself thinking of Gilgamesh as you drive or as you carry out your tasks, consider the ways you might turn grief into stewardship. Consider the walls you might build that are not merely barriers but supports. Consider the songs you might teach that will persist in small kitchens and fields. The story asks us to choose, day by day, the kinds of futures we wish to plant with our hands. The temptation to seek an outward, miraculous escape will always be there, and in some moments it might brighten a weary soul. Yet Gilgamesh shows how sometimes the truest courage is to accept the human condition and work within it. Working within limitations does not mean resigning to passivity but rather engaging more creatively with what can be shaped. In such work, meaning accrues like silt along a riverbank, slow and steady and sustaining. To remember Gilgamesh in this light is to see how a life can expand through loss rather than be consumed by it. It is to understand that immortality is less about occupying time without end and more about ensuring that time is spent in ways that cause others to flourish. Memory is the currency of that flourishing, and it is minted through acts both grand and small. The lesson is practical and poetic at once. The tale keeps giving because it refuses the easy consolation of eternal life as a single prize. Instead, it insists on a subtler recompense: the city, the stories, the work that survives. This is no false comfort. It is a recognition of human limits and a challenge to inhabit those limits with courage and compassion. Gilgamesh's journey thus becomes a long lesson on how to live when death is inevitable. When you turn off the road and walk into your home, or when you finish a task and sit for a while, think of the ways you are building memory. Consider your choices as stones laid into a wall you may never see finished. That sense of craft, of daily tending, is how many find a kind of immortality that is honest and sustaining. It is a legacy that respects both the fragility and the strength of human life. The story refuses to moralize so much as to illuminate. It offers a raw picture of yearning, of the foolish dives into the sea for a plant, and of the possibility that loss can redirect a life into generosity. It shows that immortality, to be meaningful, must be communal, a distribution of remembrance and care. In that distributed memory, individuals continue to live in the lives of others. And so the figure of Gilgamesh remains instructive, not as a model of invulnerability but as an exemplar of hard-earned wisdom. His life teaches the art of translating private tragedy into public skill. It encourages us to carve our legacies in ways that do not seek to conquer death but to give the dead company in the lives they shaped. This, perhaps, is the truest form of lastingness we can offer one another. His story is not meant to be finished by anyone, for as long as human beings grapple with loss, it will find new listeners and new meanings. Each retelling folds in the concerns of the teller, and the tale expands. We add our own deserts and floods to it, our personal humilities and grand failures, and it becomes a living text that teaches anew. In that ongoing retelling there is a sort of immortality that satisfies many of the needs that once drove kings to seek impossible plants. So listen to the tale of Gilgamesh as you would a companion on a long road, not as an instruction to escape the finite, but as a map for making the finite beautiful. Let it remind you that the craft of living is the prime work of our brief days, and that our only real immortality is in how deeply we affect those who come after. The rest is rumor and longing, both human and unavoidable. In the end, the city stands, and people remember. The walls hold names, the songs hold laughter, the canals recall footsteps, and in those things there is a kind of continuity that is enough. Gilgamesh's search for immortality did not end with an elixir but with a changed heart and a city that would tell his story for centuries. That telling is not merely about one man but about all who seek to make meaning of loss. And when the night falls and you think about what you will leave behind, remember that small labors are often the most generous. A repaired roof, a taught child, an honest record, these are the stitches that bind the living to the dead. They are ordinary acts, and they are the best antidotes to despair. Gilgamesh learned, in the end, how to build with those stitches, and so can we. Imagine a single name drifting across 4,000 years like a river leaving pale watermarks on stones. That name is Gilgamesh. It is not a single fixed portrait but a shifting set of echoes, each culture and century adding a brushstroke. As you listen, picture a city walled like a promise, sunlight on baked clay, and the first hero stepping out to shape a world he believes belongs to him. Gilgamesh is sometimes called the first hero not because he was the first person to be brave, but because he was the first to be written into a lasting myth that shaped how later peoples thought about heroism. He arrived from the clay of early Mesopotamia where kingship and myth braided into one. In that world the king could build walls, direct labor, and claim descent from gods, and Gilgamesh did all of those things with the force of a storm. Uruk was his city, a place of terraced temples and stepped streets where irrigation channels hummed under day and night. The walls attributed to him were not only physical defenses but a metaphor for civilization itself, a frame for agriculture, law, and communal memory. When you imagine Gilgamesh, you must imagine Uruk, because his deeds were told as much to explain the city as to praise a man. They tell us he was 2 parts God, 1 part man, and these proportions mattered because they made him larger than a single life and yet vulnerable to the same human strangeness of grief. His mother was the goddess Ninsun, calm and wise, and his father was human, which left him with fierce energy and a hunger for meaning. That mixture is the seed of the whole tale, power without perspective, then power meeting a rival who becomes a friend. Enkidu enters like a correction, a wild man made of dust and water, living with animals and untroubled by human law. At first he is created to distract Gilgamesh, to remind him of limits, but their meeting changes both into the axis of the story. Think of their first fight like a musical dissonance resolving into harmony, the clash that turns to mutual trust and then to a partnership that defines an era. Gilgamesh and Enkidu set out beyond the city for glory and to test the edges of the world, a classic pattern in tales that ask what it means to be human. They battle terrifying guardians and monsters, and each trial carves meaning into Gilgamesh's heart. Their deeds are not random feats, they are civic acts that protect Uruk and secure resources, but they also function as rites in which humanity learns itself. A turning point is the killing of Humbaba, the great guardian of the cedar forest, and this act sits uncomfortably between heroism and hubris. The cedar forest is ancient wood held sacred, and by destroying it the pair demonstrate both bravery and a disregard for limits. The story wants us to see consequence. What looks like victory is also a transgression that will later reverberate. Then there is the goddess Ishtar, whose ire is volcanic when Gilgamesh refuses her advances, and she sends the bull of heaven as punishment. Here the tale brings the personal into the cosmic. Lovers, or the refusal of them, can change the world. When the bull is slain, the gods decide a price must be paid, and that choice turns the light of myth toward a darker shore. Enkidu falls ill and dies, and the death of this companion becomes the hinge of the story because it forces Gilgamesh into a confrontation with his own mortality. His grief is immediate and raw. He mourns with tears and rage, and he smashes down the symbols of his city in a way that reads as both personal pain and an attack on civic life. For a listening mind, that grief is the engine of the narrative. It shapes his next acts as surely as any battle. If the first half of the epic is about fame and conquest, the second half becomes a quest for immortality, an inner voyage that crosses deserts and seas and navigates the loneliness of a king who cannot accept the finality of death. Gilgamesh seeks Utnapishtim, the figure who survived a flood and was given eternal life, and the journey is described in landscapes that feel like human psychology made geography. Each encounter along the way, ferries across black waters, sleepless mountain trials, is a litany about endurance and the search for meaning. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood, a narrative sibling to other ancient deluges, and this tale becomes a mirror in which Gilgamesh sees the arbitrary mercy of the gods. He learns that immortality was bestowed not as a right but as a rare exemption, an act of narrative necessity rather than justice. The lesson is simple and devastating. Some gifts are not for all men, and the gods are not bound to human notions of fairness. Even when Gilgamesh fails in his attempt to hold on to forever by stealing a plant that restores youth, the story refuses to let him remain untransformed by loss. The theft and the immediate loss to a slippery snake suggest that eternity cannot be plundered as if it were fruit from a market stall. Instead, the epic asks its listeners to recognize what can be kept: legacies inscribed on walls, the children one raises, the laws one writes, the city one leaves behind. The epic's attention to monuments matters because it is self-reflective. A poem that insists on walls and tablets wants its own survival, and it understands that memory is manufactured. Reading the clay tablets is like hearing someone at a long table remind you why the city keeps records and how stories make communities. Gilgamesh therefore becomes both character and instrument. He is the model the poem offers for how later people might live within the limits of mortality. One of the most extraordinary things about Gilgamesh is how it moves across languages and centuries. The story began in Sumerian city tales, then was reworked in Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian forms, each translation bending the original to new priorities and idioms. That journey reminds us that myth is porous and migratory. It changes when new readers make space for different questions and anxieties. Because it lives in fragments and tablets recovered at different times, the epic teaches us about loss as well. Whole scenes vanish, voices go missing, and the gaps are as meaningful as the lines themselves. Archaeologists have pieced together the tale from clays baked in ancient kilns and from library ruins in Nineveh, where a high priest named Ashurbanipal gathered texts as if hoarding a culture. These acts of preservation are themselves a form of legacy, a human refusal to let speech be only wind. When the modern world met Gilgamesh, it was like meeting an ancestor in a half-dream. 19th and early 20th century explorers and scholars elicited the epic from dust and then argued over its meaning. At first, the discovery reshaped our understanding of how ancient peoples thought, adding complexity to any previous narrative that saw human history as a straight line. The epic showed that deeply reflective and literary cultures existed far earlier than many had assumed. Translations bloomed and multiplied, some lyrical and others scholarly, and each interpreter made choices that illuminated parts of the tale while shadowing others. Translators are not neutral conduits. Their own questions, their languages, and their times shape the story they hand to listeners. That is why the Gilgamesh you read or hear will echo the translator's concerns, whether those be religious, existential, or literary. But beyond scholarship, the epic has found modern life because its central theme, mortality, refuses to be period-bound. In hospitals, classrooms, and living rooms, people still turn to Gilgamesh because the narrative offers a kind of companionable grief and a model for how to live after loss. The hero's journey is an archetype that helps people locate their own pain and purpose within a longer human project. Its imagery, the city walls, the cedar forest, the great flood, has been mined by poets and artists who seek visual language for human limits and generosity. Painters sketch hulking warriors against a sky that looks like old tin, and filmmakers cast long shadows on cracked earth to show that time is both enemy and teacher. Every new medium that takes up the story rearranges its cadences but keeps its bones. There are more subtle currents in the text that reward patient listening. Gilgamesh's relationship with the gods is not simply rebellion, and his moral development is not linear. He begins as a ruler who imposes himself and moves, through experience, toward a stewardship that recognizes obligation to others. The epic refuses comfortable moralizing. It shows power's pleasures and its dangers, then invites readers to complete the moral equation. The theme of friendship in the epic remains one of the most tender and radical elements because it humanizes a figure otherwise elevated by divine ancestry. Enkidu is not a mere sidekick. He is an equal whose death reveals to Gilgamesh what matters most. In modern psychological terms, the bond teaches about attachment, loss, and the capacity for grief to transform identity. Ancient audiences might have heard the story and thought of communal obligations and kingly duties, while modern listeners hear echoes of contemporary loneliness, anxiety, and the search for meaning. That coexistence of ancient civic concerns and modern existential ones is a reason the poem has persisted. It becomes, for each era, a map with different legends depending on who is reading. The flood story within the epic compels attention because it resonates across cultures and centuries. It belongs to a family of ancestral deluges that include elements of warning and rebirth. Utnapishtim's narrative sits like a mirror reflecting human behavior toward divine forces, showing that survival can be accidental and miraculous, and that being favored once does not establish a general rule. The story thus unpacks the precariousness of human life and resists consolations that deny contingency. As scholars dug into the tablets, they discovered that the poem itself was layered, with older Sumerian songs stitched into later Akkadian bricks like different ages of wood in a single ship. Each layer brought new motifs and sometimes a different tone, suggesting the epic was not a static artifact but a living composition. That method of accretion echoes how actual cities grow, with basements of former streets beneath new paving. The archaeological contexts of the tablets remind the modern listener that texts are artifacts embedded in political and physical histories. Libraries are built under kings, and the reasons kings collect stories are sometimes as much about legitimizing authority as about curiosity. Ashurbanipal's collection, for example, was pragmatic as well as literary. To collect memory is to claim a place in the lineage of power. When museums removed clay tablets to distant capitals, the story of Gilgamesh acquired another layer of meaning: colonial appropriation and the ethics of cultural heritage. For many communities, the displacement of artifacts felt like a theft of memory, an extraction not unlike earlier plunder. Contemporary debates about repatriation and collaborative stewardship have become part of the epic's modern afterlife, reminding listeners that stories travel on complicated routes. Yet despite those controversies, the raw human center of the text speaks through. It is Blaise Pascal in a different dress, an awareness that the heart has its reasons which reason does not know. Gilgamesh feels emotions that are recognizable across centuries, which explains why people respond to him not as a distant myth but as a fellow human confronting the same mystery. In literary terms, Gilgamesh may be seen as a prototype of the hero who is both exceptional and fallible, a pattern repeated over millennia in Homer, in Beowulf, and through to modern epics. But where Homer tends to celebrate martial fame, Gilgamesh questions the value of fame when it cannot buy life. This introspective quality pushes the poem into a sphere where poetry and philosophy meet. The poem's language is sometimes plain and sometimes ornate, with invocations, dialogues, and images that fold into one another like pressed leaves in a book. This alternation is a rhythm that suits the oral traditions from which the tale emerged. It was meant to be heard and remembered, not only read. Performers would have emphasized cadences and pauses, and those oral choices shaped how listeners understood the story. Performance contexts mattered too. Recitations at festivals, palace readouts, or private education would have each altered the poem's reception. A festival audience hears a triumphant beginning differently from a mourner reading the middle at a wake. The tale thus functions like a musical score that changes when played in different rooms. The erotic and the political intersect in the subplot with Ishtar, and modern readers can find in that episode a commentary on desire and the abuses of power. Ishtar is not merely a scorned woman, she is a deity whose sexual politics influence earthly fates, and Gilgamesh's refusal is both personal and political. Their confrontation asks who gets to claim bodies and loyalties in a world where divinity can command storms. Gilgamesh's kingship evolves in response to his trials, shifting from a model of domination to one of legacy building. He returns to Uruk with the heavier wisdom that what endures is often structural and social rather than purely personal. When the poem describes the city's walls in vivid terms, the listener hears a poem about civic responsibility dressed as architecture. Part of the epic's enduring power is its moral ambiguity. It refuses to provide tidy moral answers and instead offers scenes in which listeners must sit with complexity. This is a story that trusts its audience to engage with contradiction, to hold admiration and critique at once. That openness has invited reinterpretation across centuries, ensuring the epic's flexibility and relevance. The modern era has used Gilgamesh in surprising ways, often as a mirror to contemporary anxieties about technology, empire, and mortality. In times of rapid change, the poem becomes a lens through which to ask whether human ingenuity can outrun human limits. Whether the question is industrialization or artificial intelligence, the old lines of the epic engage modern dilemmas about scale and consequence. In classrooms, the poem serves as a bridge between antiquity and modern ethics. Teachers coax students to compare Gilgamesh's grief to contemporary forms of loss and to consider how societies remember leaders. Students are taught to listen for dissent in the text and to reflect on how narratives of power shape social norms. Through these pedagogical practices, the epic becomes a living tool for civic education. For psychologists and therapists, the story can be a resource for exploring grief and the process of individuation, the movement from ego-driven action to an acceptance of relational responsibility. Enkidu's death functions as an archetypal wound that triggers necessary transformation in Gilgamesh. Therapists sometimes point to the tale to illustrate how loss can catalyze deeper social repair and a reorientation toward collective goods. In art and poetry, the epic inspires images of resilience and ruin, and contemporary poets have used Gilgamesh as a site for imagining loss in the face of war, displacement, and environmental collapse. The cedar forest becomes a symbol for endangered ecosystems, and the flood becomes an emblem for climate disruption. Through such acts of metaphor, the ancient tale becomes a commentary on current crises. The epic has a surprising number of resonances with modern storytelling forms, from graphic novels that draw its scenes to films that fold its trajectory into contemporary plots. These adaptations are not always literal. They tend to translate themes, friendship, mortality, civic duty, into new idioms and thereby enlarge the poem's audience. Each adaptation raises questions about fidelity to an original that is itself a palimpsest. Musicians compose cycles inspired by the poem's arcs, and some have set parts of it to music that aims to capture the epic's alternating tones of adrenaline and lament. The musical forms chosen often highlight the story's emotional extremes: triumph, cruelty, tenderness, despair. Listening to a musical interpretation can reveal how rhythm and sound unlock hidden contours of narrative. Religious thinkers across time have read Gilgamesh skeptically and admiringly, sometimes seeing it as a secular counterpoint to sacred texts, and sometimes as a shared heritage that speaks to universal concerns. The flood story's overlap with other religious narratives has provoked theological reflection on why similar stories appear across distant cultures. In these conversations, the epic acts as a provocation, urging reflection on the nature of human divinity and divine humanness. Feminist readings have focused on the roles and representations of female figures like Nin-sun and Ishtar, exploring how women in the epic hold power differently from men. Ninsun's wisdom is often understated but crucial. She interprets dreams and blesses the hero in ways that shape his destiny. Ishtar is complex, sometimes destructive, sometimes victimized by rejection. Her presence asks listeners to look closely at gendered expectations and the politics of desire. Environmental readings examine the cedar forest and the flood as warnings about the costs of resource extraction and hubristic conquest. Clearing the forest is not merely a heroic feat. In modern terms, it reads as ecological violence that damages the balance between human need and natural limits. That interpretation resonates in an era increasingly conscious of sustainability and long-term consequences. Scholars of empire see the epic as an artifact of statecraft, a text that could be used to explain and justify central authority while simultaneously providing a critical mirror. Gilgamesh is both model and object lesson. His early arrogance validates control, and his later humility recommends responsibility. As such, the poem sits uneasily between propaganda and critique, and that tension makes it alive for political thinkers. Language specialists marvel at the poem as a monument of early writing because it shows how narrative forms adapt to technological means like cuneiform script. The constraints of clay and stylus-shaped sentence rhythms and repeated formulas, and those forms left their imprint on the text's structure. Understanding how medium shapes message is another way the epic teaches modern readers about the interplay of form and content. The discovery of the tablets in different conditions means the poem sometimes arrives to us broken. And this fragmentary nature has produced imaginative reconstructions that are as much creative acts as scholarly exercises. Scholars fill gaps with reasoned guesses, and poets sometimes choose to fill them with bold invention. That interplay between reconstruction and invention mirrors the broader way humanity rebuilds narratives from memory and loss. Modern archaeology, with its technical tools like satellite surveys and digital modeling, has reanimated the spaces of the poem, revealing canals, walls, and foundations that resemble the landscapes described. Those physical traces make it easier to imagine Uruk not as an abstract city but as a living weave of households and markets. The lived city is what Gilgamesh's listeners would have inhabited, and archaeology helps us recover the texture of that life. There is also a metaphysical thread to the text. The poem asks what kinds of immortality are meaningful and whether fame is sufficient. Gilgamesh learns that inscription, bringing one's name onto brick in song, creates a kind of afterlife, a communal memory carried by others. The poem's final lines, where the hero looks upon Uruk and names the walls, reframe immortality as communal continuance rather than personal perpetuity. In literary history, the epic's rediscovery influenced Western ideas of antiquity, pushing the timeline of literary sophistication farther back than previously acknowledged. It challenged assumptions that intellectual and poetic life began with later Mediterranean cultures. That repositioning reshaped the study of literature and prompted a broader appreciation for the diversity of ancient voices. Psychologically, the arc of the tale maps onto a movement from ego to structure, from fantastical attempts to conquer endings to the sober acceptance of communal frameworks. Gilgamesh's final act of returning to the city suggests that the best answer to mortality is to build things that outlast a single life. Those built things, laws, walls, stories, are the true inventions that allow a civilization to continue. The ethical complexities in the poem resist a simple moral, and this richness has made it fertile ground for moral philosophers who are interested in how communities teach their young to handle power. The epic is less about condemning ambition than about teaching temperance through story. It conveys that leaders must be accountable not only to gods but to the people and future inhabitants of the city. Gilgamesh's afterlife in literature is curious. He appears, disappears, reappears, reimagined in novels, poems, and films, always altered by new contexts. Sometimes he is recast as a demigod, sometimes as a flawed but sympathetic ruler. The elasticity of his image is a measure of the story's power. Flexible icons survive longer than rigid ones. The study of Gilgamesh has also illuminated the role of scribes in schools in ancient Mesopotamia. Scribes were not mere copyists, but cultural curators who chose what to preserve and teach. Their work shaped the values of their civilization by deciding which stories were worth storing in clay. Realizing the agency of scribes helps modern listeners appreciate the social labor behind memory. In contemporary politics, pundits sometimes evoke Gilgamesh as an example of leadership gone awry, or of the need for leaders who understand limits. The poem thus serves as a rhetorical resource for arguing about humility and restraint in public office. Those political uses reveal how ancient stories can be weaponized or mobilized for present-day ends. For historians, the epic offers clues about daily life, clothing, food, social customs, and the legal norms that structured Mesopotamian society. Even where the poem is poetic rather than documentary, the embedded cultural details help reconstruct pedestrian realities. That blending of the lyrical and the descriptive gives the text anthropological value. The modern concept of the hero owes something to Gilgamesh because the poem complicates heroism by pairing it with accountability. Later epic heroes often pick up that duality. They are larger than life but bound by community. Understanding this lineage helps explain how modern narratives manage fame and failure. Some readings cast Gilgamesh as an existential figure, a man confronting the absurdity of death without recourse to simple answers. He quests not for a system but for a remedy to finitude, and the story's refusal to grant him that remedy speaks to a sober view of human limits. That existential reading resonates powerfully in times of epidemic and war, when human beings feel exposed and ordinary certainties collapse. There are also moments of comic relief in the tale, small human gestures that bring warmth, the companionship between the two heroes, the teasing exchange, the humility in certain prayers. These human moments make the larger solemn themes bearable and relatable. They remind audiences that ancient lives contained the same mixture of tenderness and absurdity we experience now. The epic's influence on narrative form can be traced to structural elements like journey motifs, tests, and the use of flashback in Utnapishtim's flood tale. These techniques became staples of storytelling, reappearing in countless later texts and films. Observing these continuities enriches our appreciation for ancient inventiveness. Gilgamesh's presence in popular culture varies. Sometimes he is invoked by name, and other times his motifs are adapted into new characters who carry only the faintest echo of the original. That ebb and flow show how cultural memory works. Some fragments remain bright while others fade into general patterns. The persistence of certain motifs, like the friendship in the flood, suggests those elements touch enduring human nerves. The physical relics that preserve the poem have their own biographies: broken tablets, burnt tablets, clay jars whose inscriptions survived when buildings did not. Each object bears marks of time, handling, heat, and decay, forming a material history that parallels the poem's narrative. Handling these artifacts in museums is to hold the fragment of a thought that once moved a living community. At the same time, the story can be misused, and part of modern stewardship is protecting it from simplistic interpretations that flatten its complexity. When a myth becomes a slogan, it loses the intricacies that made it resonant. Responsible readers and curators therefore encourage nuance, contextual study, and attention to the material history behind the text. Aesthetic strategies in the poem, economy of phrase, repeated refrains, abrupt images, work like grooves in a record, guiding the memory and making the lines easy to carry. Those patterns supported oral preservation and helped listeners hold the story in their minds across generations. We owe the poem's survival to features that made it memorable as much as to the clay that preserved it. When post-colonial scholars examine the epic, they often focus on the power relations encoded in its preservation and transmission. Who gets to tell ancient stories, and who benefits from circulating them? These questions complicate the simple delight of rediscovery with ethical reflection about historical privilege and the uneven flows of cultural capital. The poetic voice within the epic sometimes shifts, and attentive listeners can sense the seams where older songs were incorporated into a larger narrative. These seams are not flaws but inscriptions of process, making the poem a living archive of its own development. Listening for those seams becomes a way of hearing history as it is made. Gilgamesh also provides a vocabulary for thinking about civic memory, the ways societies commemorate leaders, the public works that codify values, and the rituals that sustain community. The poem itself is part of that vocabulary, a model for how narratives memorialize. Its prescription is subtle: build, remember, and share stories that bind people beyond single lifespans. The ethics of leadership that emerge from the poem are reflective rather than prescriptive. The story offers scenarios rather than legislative codes. In doing so, it practices moral pedagogy, inviting readers to ask how power should be exercised rather than telling them outright. That invitation has kept the text relevant in cultures with very different political systems. From a biographical angle, the figure of Gilgamesh has been reimagined as both tyrant and reformer, and the tension between those roles is instructive because it mirrors real historical rulers who used violence and reforms in tandem. The duality shows how transformative leadership can be ambiguous and how public works can coexist with private violence. Recognizing that messiness is part of learning from the past. The narrative's layered cosmology names gods who intertwine with human fate and yet occasionally act without comprehensible justice, a concept that provokes theological and philosophical reflection. How, the poem asks indirectly, should humans relate to capricious powers that can reward or punish without consistent laws? Even if modern listeners do not accept divine frameworks, the question becomes an allegory for relating to impersonal systems that govern our lives. Gilgamesh's pursuit of meaning in the face of death is something listeners return to again and again because it is a fundamental human problem. We hear the poem and think of our own restless searches, hospitalization rooms lit by machines, funerals where stories are retold, the endless desire to be remembered. That resonance is part of why the epic continues to be read and performed. The epic's depiction of grief is stark and instructive, not catharsis into tidy closure, but a messy, lingering ache that changes identity. Gilgamesh's rage, his bargaining with gods, his bargaining with himself, map onto stages of mourning that psychologists recognize. From this perspective, the tale can be used as a narrative therapy tool that helps people situate their loss within larger human patterns. Because the tale exists in multiple versions, there are debates about which variant is authoritative, but that debate itself is revealing because it shows how communities shape texts to reflect their needs. No single original controls meaning. Instead, meaning is negotiated through retellings. That fluidity allows the poem to remain a living text instead of a fossil. Modern storytellers sometimes mine Gilgamesh for motives that align with contemporary heroic arcs. A flawed leader learns to serve others, a wild man becomes civil, a friend's death becomes moral education. These motifs remain potent because they are psychologically convincing. We recognize their truth in ourselves and in public life. The epic's enduring motifs have thus become instructive for both personal development and civic pedagogy. The epic's motifs also appear in the study of comparative mythology, where researchers trace parallel stories and ask why similar themes recur across cultures. Flood myths, hero companions, and quests for immortality appear in many traditions, and exploring these parallels helps illuminate shared human anxieties and inventions. Gilgamesh's place in that web is both central and illuminating. In museums, the epic is often displayed with a tenderness that belies its age, with labels that try to give visitors a sense of both the artifact's antiquity and its continuing relevance. The curation choices, what to highlight, what to contextualize, shape public impressions of the poem and guide collective memory. Thoughtful display can make the past feel intimate rather than alien. For writers seeking a voice that bridges violence and compassion, Gilgamesh provides models of narrative complexity that are hard to surpass. His trajectory from impulsive domination to a more reflective stewardship is a template for stories that wish to explore the moral cost of power. Writers borrow this structure when they want to show that wisdom often arrives via grief. As archaeological methods progress, new discoveries occasionally alter how scholars read the poem, and each new tablet can shift interpretations like a small wave changing the shoreline. The scholarship is therefore dynamic, and listening to the debate is part of appreciating the epic's vibrancy. The living nature of the text is not only literary but academic. The epic's resonance in education is also practical. It offers a vehicle for teaching narrative technique, historical empathy, and cross-cultural literacy. Students learn to compare ancient and modern values and to see how narratives shape social identities. The story thus serves multiple pedagogies at once, exercising imagination and critical thought. Contemporary artists often use Gilgamesh to interrogate memory and loss in the wake of displacement and violence. Refugee narratives and war stories sometimes echo the epic's combination of wandering and yearning. The figure of the hero who must find meaning in a changed world is especially relevant where social structures have collapsed and rebuilding becomes necessary. In such contexts, the epic becomes a cautionary tale but also a source of resilience. The poem's ending, which returns the hero to his city, rewards attention because it reframes the journey as cyclical rather than teleological. He leaves seeking roots and returns to contribute to them. That structural closure suggests that quests are sometimes meant to renew commitment to community rather than to escape mortality. The return home becomes a form of wisdom. In everyday language, Gilgamesh has slipped into idioms and metaphors that signal great strength or ancient authority, and those echoes remind us that ancient names can become shorthand for complex human qualities. Such shorthand can hide nuance, but it also carries the weight of centuries of storytelling. When someone speaks of a Gilgamesh-like figure, they invoke a compressed set of meanings about ambition and consequence. The story also prompts reflections on how cultural memory survives through institutions. Temples, schools, and libraries are the scaffolding of remembered selves. Gilgamesh's survival is not accidental but the product of a cultural matrix that valued record-keeping and public storytelling. Understanding that infrastructure helps modern societies imagine how to preserve their own stories. As scientific knowledge expands, questions about longevity shift from mythic quests to technological possibilities, and the ancient story gains new life as we debate bioethics and the limits of life extension. If we someday extend lifespans dramatically, Gilgamesh's concerns will feel eerily contemporary. What should be preserved and at what cost? The epic thus acts as an early meditation on questions that will become ever more urgent in a technologically advanced future. Even the poem's faults are instructive. Its silences about certain populations, its focus on elite figures, and its imperial contexts reveal limits of perspective. Critically engaging those gaps is part of responsible reading. A full appreciation of the epic requires seeing both its strengths and its blind spots. Gilgamesh's legacy continues to be reworked in popular novels where authors reimagine the ancient king in modern settings, sometimes as an immortal figure in contemporary times, sometimes as an ancestor visited through dreams. These retellings explore how ancient archetypes can be adapted to contemporary moral dilemmas. They ask whether the old stories have new wisdom for new ages. The poem's compact moral complexity invites debate rather than didactic conclusions. Listeners are left with enduring questions rather than answers. This endurance is the core of legacy. An artifact that keeps asking questions across generations is more alive than one that only provides solved solutions. Gilgamesh remains active because it keeps returning those questions to each new age. Consider how the epic helps define human limits without insisting they are final. In doing so, it opens ethical imagination. It suggests that mortality does not negate significance and that actions within life counsel those who come after. This lesson is the bedrock of civic cultures that prize memory and public goods. In print and in performance, the epic sometimes feels intimate and sometimes grandiose, but both modes serve the same purpose: to ask how we should live together when no single life can encompass all that matters. The poem's range lets listeners approach it from many angles: historical, psychological, philosophical, and each approach yields new insights. That openness is part of its enduring appeal. Finally, think of Gilgamesh as a conversation partner from the ancient world who will not let modern listeners indulge in easy certainties. He challenges us to reckon with time, community, and the uses of power. To listen to the epic fully is to enter that conversation and to carry its questions forward in the ways we build, remember, and love.